My boss fired me for no reason. Within a few weeks, I put him out of business. My boss fired me without any reason, but just a few weeks later, I made sure he had no business left to run. I had worked at that company for almost 5 years. I wasn't the highest paid, I wasn't the flashiest employee, but I was the one who always stayed late, fixed other people's mistakes, and held everything together when things got messy. My boss, Richard, knew this very well. And yet, instead of appreciating me, he thrived on belittling me in front of everyone. He called me replaceable. He laughed at my ideas in meetings, only to present them as his own a week later. I tolerated it for a long time because, honestly, I needed the job. But one day, without warning, he called me into his office. No small talk, no explanation, just a cold statement. We're letting you go. Pack your things by noon. I asked why, and he smirked. Because I can. And because you're nothing without this place. That sentence burned itself into my mind. Nothing without this place. It was more than a dismissal. It was an attempt to erase me, to convince me that my worth ended with his company. I walked out with my box of belongings, humiliated, while he stood in the doorway with that arrogant little grin, watching me like I was trash being taken out. The first few days were brutal. Anger mixed with self-pity, and I couldn't sleep. But then, something shifted. The more I thought about Richard, the more I realized he had made a very dangerous mistake. You see, he thought firing me stripped me of all power. What he didn't realize was that I had spent years inside his company, watching, listening, and understanding every single flaw in his empire. I knew his shady business deals. I knew his illegal shortcuts. I knew about the offshore accounts he thought nobody could trace. And I also knew the clients he had screwed over, the ones who would gladly see him destroyed if someone gave them the right push. So I made a decision. If Richard believed I was nothing without his company, I would prove him wrong in the most devastating way possible. I wasn't just going to get even. I was going to dismantle everything he had built, brick by brick, until there was nothing left for him to stand on. The plan started small. I reached out to a few colleagues who secretly hated him as much as I did. Richard thought fear kept them loyal, but resentment is a powerful motivator. I planted the first seeds by leaking a few innocent rumors, just enough to create unease. Within days, whispers spread through the office about questionable practices at the top. People didn't know the full story, but the seed of doubt was already there. And doubt spreads faster than truth. At the same time, I went after his most vulnerable spot, his clients. Richard's arrogance had cost him more allies than he realized. I knew exactly which contracts he had violated, which invoices he had delayed, and which promises he had broken. Quietly, I contacted those clients, not as myself, but under a carefully crafted alias. I told them I had evidence of how Richard was cheating them, and I offered to share it. When they bit, I delivered. I had emails, reports, even recorded conversations. Every piece of dirt I had collected over the years became a weapon, and it worked. One by one, clients began pulling their contracts. Some demanded refunds. Others threatened lawsuits. Richard was too arrogant to understand why his empire was crumbling so quickly. From the outside, it looked like pure bad luck, but I knew it was my hand guiding every domino. The beauty of it was the timing. I didn't unleash everything at once. I wanted him to feel it slowly, painfully, like a rope tightening around his neck. First a lost contract here, then a small scandal there. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, it was already too late. His investors were nervous, his employees were panicking, and the pressure was crushing him. But I wasn't finished. I wanted the final blow to be unforgettable. Richard loved showing off his wealth, his flashy car, his mansion, his expensive vacations. So I turned my attention to his finances. Remember those offshore accounts? Let's just say a few anonymous tips to the right authorities go a long way. When investigators began sniffing around, Richard's confidence turned into desperation. He scrambled to cover his tracks, but everything he touched only exposed him further. And then came the day I had been waiting for. Richard was sitting in his office, surrounded by chaos, when the news broke. His company was being officially investigated for fraud. His investors pulled out overnight. His clients abandoned him. His own employees turned on him. And there he was, alone, powerless, watching his empire collapse in real time. That same afternoon, I walked past the building one last time. Through the glass windows, I saw him, hunched over his desk, screaming into his phone like a man drowning. And for the first time, I smiled. Because he was right about one thing. I was nothing without that place. But what he didn't realize was that he was nothing without me. So tell me, would you have done the same in my position? Or would you have let him get away with it? You think watching his company collapse was the end? Oh no, that was just the beginning. After Richard's empire began crumbling, I should have felt satisfied. I should have walked away, content with the fact that his arrogance finally cost him everything. But here's the thing about revenge, it's addictive. Once you get that first taste of justice, you start craving more. And Richard had humiliated me so thoroughly that a financial collapse wasn't enough. I didn't just want his company gone. I wanted his reputation shredded, his name poisoned, his comfortable little life burned to the ground until he was nothing more than a cautionary tale. The next stage of my plan required patience. See, while Richard's empire was collapsing, he still had safety nets, money stashed away, wealthy friends, and a family who believe his lies about being a successful businessman. If I left him there, he'd eventually rebuild. Maybe smaller, maybe slower, but a man like him never stays down unless someone makes sure he can't get back up. That someone, of course, was me. I started with his family. Not by hurting them. No, I'm not a monster. But by showing them who Richard really was. His wife, Margaret, believed he was a self-made genius. His teenage son admired him, thought his father was untouchable. But I had documents, proof of his lies, his affairs, even the money he funneled away behind Margaret's back. A carefully timed anonymous envelope arrived at their home, packed with evidence that painted Richard not as a businessman, but as a fraud and a cheat. The fallout was delicious. Margaret filed for divorce almost immediately. She took the house, the car, and most importantly, half of what little remained of his fortune. His son refused to speak to him, embarrassed and furious. Overnight, Richard's perfect family man image turned into a tabloid nightmare. Photos of him arguing with his wife on the courthouse steps made headlines. For a man who loved appearances more than anything, that kind of humiliation cut deeper than bankruptcy. But I wasn't done twisting the knife. Remember those colleagues who secretly hated him? I gave them one final gift, the chance to bury him publicly. I leaked internal company documents, emails that proved years of shady deals, tax evasion, and employee abuse. Journalists ate it up. Within days, Richard's name was plastered across news outlets, not as a CEO, but as a crook. The narrative shifted from unlucky businessman under investigation to corrupt fraud exposed. His so-called friends and high places cut ties instantly. No one wants to stand near a sinking ship. At this point, Richard was finished in the corporate world. No investor would touch him. No client would return his calls. But I wanted one last piece of satisfaction, the personal confrontation. After all, he had looked me in the eye when he fired me, smug and superior, certain that I was powerless. I wanted him to see just how wrong he had been. So I arranged it. I waited outside the courthouse one morning, knowing he'd be there for yet another hearing. When he finally appeared, he looked nothing like the man I once knew. His tailored suits had been replaced by cheap, wrinkled clothing. His hair was unkempt, his face hollow, his eyes filled with panic and exhaustion. He looked like a ghost of himself, and I couldn't help but smile. He noticed me instantly. For a moment, he froze, as if he couldn't believe it. Then he marched over, rage boiling in his expression. "You," he hissed. "You did this to me." I tilted my head and said, calm and steady, "You fired me, Richard. Remember? Said I was nothing without this place. But tell me, how's the place doing without me?" His face turned red. He wanted to scream, maybe even hit me, but the cameras around us kept him in check. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, a pathetic string of curses, before storming inside. That was the last time I saw him in person, because shortly after, Richard's life collapsed completely. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized. The lawsuits piled up until he drowned in legal fees. He tried to start over, but every attempt was crushed by the weight of his ruined name. No one trusted him. No one respected him, and no one wanted him around. And me? I moved on. I found a new job. Not just a job, but a career with people who actually valued me. I was free from a shadow, stronger than ever, and proud of what I'd accomplished. But sometimes, late at night, I think back to that day in his office, the smug look on his face as he told me I was nothing. And I can't help but laugh, because in the end, I was the one who stripped everything from him. So, here's my question for you. If someone humiliated you, destroyed your livelihood, and tried to erase your worth, would you have gone as far as I did? Or would you have walked away? You think it ended with his company gone, his family broken, and his reputation in ruins? No, that was just the second act. The real destruction was still to come. For most people, losing everything would be enough punishment. They'd disappear quietly, try to rebuild in some small corner of the world, and maybe live a quieter life. But not Richard. His ego wouldn't allow him to vanish. Even after his business collapsed, even after his wife divorced him and his name was dragged through the mud, he clung to the idea that he could rise again. He told anyone who would listen that he was coming back, that his enemies, meaning me, though he never said it directly, would regret ever crossing him. I could have let it go. By then, I had moved on to a better job, surrounded by people who respected me. My life was improving, while his was crumbling. But every time I heard about his delusional attempts to crawl back into the spotlight, I felt that old fire burning inside me. Because Richard didn't just ruin my job, he tried to erase my identity. He needed to be erased himself. So I dug deeper. I wanted to uncover not just the shady business practices I'd already exposed, but the skeletons hidden so deeply that even Richard thought they were safe. And let me tell you, when you spend years as the person who cleans up everyone else's mess in a company, you see things you're not supposed to. Files accidentally left open. Conversations overheard. Passwords scribbled on sticky notes. And Richard was careless. It started with an old hard drive I had copied before I left. At the time, I kept it as insurance just in case. Now it became my weapon. On that drive, buried in forgotten folders, were records of things far worse than fraud. He had bribed officials to land contracts, blackmailed rivals, even funneled money through shell corporations to hide his illegal ventures. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal, the kind of evidence that could put him behind bars for years. But here's the beautiful part. I didn't hand it over all at once. No, that would have been too merciful. Instead, I leaked pieces strategically through anonymous sources. A little here, a little there. Enough to make the authorities dig deeper each time. Every time Richard thought he had survived the worst of it, another wave would hit. It was like watching a drowning man fight to keep his head above water while the tide kept rising. The stress started showing. Rumors spread about his breakdowns in public, screaming at waiters in restaurants, collapsing drunk outside bars, ranting about conspiracies against him. The man who once strutted around like a king now looked like a lunatic. His old friends, the wealthy ones who once toasted champagne with him, stopped answering his calls. Even the few business partners who might have helped him rebuild wanted nothing to do with him. And then came the collapse of his last safety net, his finances. Remember those offshore accounts I exposed? That was only part of it. He had debts, massive ones, hidden behind layers of fake companies. When I sent an anonymous tip to one of his creditors, the dominoes began falling fast. Collectors came knocking, lawsuits multiplied, and suddenly Richard wasn't a man trying to stage a comeback. He was a man running from the wolves. I almost felt pity watching him sink lower and lower. Almost. But then I remembered that smirk the day he fired me. I remembered his words. "You're nothing without this place." That memory kept me sharp, kept me focused. Because I wasn't just destroying Richard, I was making a statement. The final push came sooner than I expected. One morning, headlines exploded across the news. Richard had been officially indicted. The charges were massive: fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, bribery. The kind of list that guarantees you're not walking free. Cameras swarmed him as police escorted him out of his crumbling mansion in handcuffs. The once powerful CEO, the man who thought he was untouchable, looked like a broken criminal. And here's the delicious twist. The arrest didn't just destroy Richard. It made me. You see, some of those anonymous leaks? They led to journalists investigating not just Richard, but also the corruption in the industry as a whole. People started asking who had the courage to blow the whistle. Slowly, whispers began to spread about me. The loyal employee who stood up to the tyrant. I never admitted it outright, of course, but let's just say my reputation skyrocketed. I went from being invisible to being respected, even admired. But Richard? He went from calling himself a king to being just another inmate in an orange jumpsuit. His empire was ashes, his family gone, his name disgraced, his freedom stripped away. And all of it, every last bit of it, was because he underestimated me. Sometimes people ask me if I regret it, if maybe I went too far. After all, I didn't just ruin his career, I annihilated his entire life. But then I think back to that moment in his office, when he looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing. And I realize I didn't just get revenge. I rewrote the story. I proved that the man who thought he had all the power was powerless in the face of someone he dismissed. So tell me, was it justice? Or was it cruelty? If you were in my shoes, would you have stopped at bankrupting him? Or would you have gone all the way until there was nothing left? You think prison was his rock bottom? Oh no. Prison was just where his real nightmare began. When Richard was sentenced, I thought my work was finished. He was locked away, stripped of everything he valued. Money, status, freedom. I figured I could finally let it rest. But then, I heard the stories. And when I tell you what happened next, you'll understand why walking away wasn't an option. At first, Richard tried to play the same game behind bars that he played in the boardroom. He strutted in like he was still a CEO, barking orders, trying to intimidate other inmates, even bribing guards with whatever scraps of money he had left. But here's the thing. In the real world, money and power can protect you. In prison, respect comes from strength, not status. And Richard had none. He was soft, arrogant, and delusional. It didn't take long before the predators smelled weakness. The beatings started small, shoves in the cafeteria line, a stolen tray of food. But they escalated quickly. Rumors reached me that Richard had been jumped in the showers, left bleeding on the floor. Another time, he was forced to hand over his commissary to the toughest gang in the block. And each time, he tried to bluff his way out, insisting he'd get back on top soon. Nobody bought it. He was prey. And in prison, prey doesn't last long. Now, I could have ignored this. I could have said, "Good, let him suffer." But then I remembered what he once said about me. "You're nothing without this place." And I realized I wanted to make sure he never forgot me. Not even in prison. So I made some calls. Remember those contacts I had, the clients he betrayed, the colleagues he humiliated, the investors he cheated? Well, some of them had connections. Not corporate connections. Prison connections. And with just a few carefully placed words, I ensured that Richard's life behind bars would be unforgettable. One day, he woke up to find his cellmate replaced by someone who really didn't like crooked businessmen. Another day, the guards accidentally assigned him to work detail with a group of inmates who despised people like him. It was almost comical. Every time he thought he had found a safe corner, it turned out to be another trap. The humiliation was constant. The man who once strutted in $1,000 suits was now scrubbing toilets while other inmates laughed. The man who once belittled me in meetings was now forced to keep his head down, too afraid to make eye contact. He went from predator to prey, from king to jester, and the transformation was brutal. But the real masterpiece? That came when I made sure the outside world never forgot his disgrace. See, Richard thought prison would give him time to plot his comeback. He even wrote letters, rambling, pathetic manifestos about how he was wrongfully accused, and how he'd return one day, stronger than ever. I got my hands on those letters, and then I leaked them. The media devoured them. Overnight, Richard wasn't just a disgraced CO, he was a laughingstock. Headlines mocked his delusions, late-night comedians tore him apart, and the internet turned his quotes into memes. Imagine seeing your pathetic pleas for relevance plastered across social media, ridiculed by millions. For a man whose ego once thrived on admiration, that was worse than any prison beating. And still, I wasn't done. You see, While Richard rotted away, I was thriving. My career soared, my network grew, and my influence spread. The same industry that once bowed to him now came to me for advice, for leadership, for vision. I became everything he claimed I could never be, and I made sure he knew it. Every few months, I'd send him a little update, an anonymous letter detailing my successes. A new promotion, a new house, a new partnership, always ending with the same line. How's the place doing without me? I don't know if he screamed when he read them, or if he just sat there in silence, broken. But I know he read them, and that's all that mattered. Eventually, Richard tried to get out early on parole. He claimed he had learned his lesson and was ready to rejoin society. The parole board laughed in his face. His record of fights, disciplinary actions, and pathetic attempts to manipulate the system spoke louder than his words. Denied, over and over again. By the time he reached the halfway mark of his sentence, Richard wasn't the same man. He was thinner, older, with sunken eyes and a permanent shake in his hands. He shuffled instead of striding. He whispered instead of barking orders. And the last reports I heard, he was completely alone. No family visits. No friends left. Not even his lawyer cared anymore. And me? I slept like a baby, because I knew his suffering wasn't just punishment. It was poetry. So tell me, what do you think? Was I too cruel for making sure his punishment didn't stop at prison walls? Or was it exactly the justice a man like Richard deserved? You think his time in prison was the end of the story? No. The end came later, and it was darker than even I imagined. By the time Richard had spent years behind bars, he was a shell of the man I once knew. The arrogant, smug CEO who had fired me with a grin was gone. In his place was a broken, paranoid, aging man clinging to the last scraps of dignity he had left. Most people assumed his life was already over. But I knew better. Sometimes the final blow doesn't come from handcuffs or prison walls. It comes from the world forgetting you. When Richard was finally released, the world had moved on without him. There were no reporters waiting at the gates, no family to greet him, no friends offering him a ride. He walked out alone, carrying nothing but a garbage bag with a few clothes. And just like that, the man who once commanded $1 million empire was reduced to nothing more than a ghost drifting through the city. But he still clung to the fantasy of rebuilding. He tried, desperately, to get back into the business world. He called old contacts. None answered. He sent resumes. None replied. He showed up to industry events, uninvited, only to be escorted out by security while people whispered and laughed. He had become infamous, a living warning of what arrogance and corruption can do. And still, he kept trying. That's when I decided to deliver the final chapter of his downfall. Remember how he once told me I was nothing without this place? Well, now I was determined to show him what it felt like to truly be nothing. Not hated, not feared, not even respected, just forgotten. I orchestrated a quiet, invisible campaign. Every time Richard tried to get a job, I made sure employers were reminded of his past. An anonymous email here, a forwarded article there. Every time he tried to rent an apartment, the landlord received a warning about his history. Even when he tried dating again, his profile mysteriously flooded with links to his scandals. Slowly but surely, every attempt he made to crawl back into relevance turned into humiliation. He became a ghost in his own life. He wandered the streets, muttering to himself about conspiracies, blaming the world for his downfall. He lived in cheap motels, then in shelters, then sometimes nowhere at all. I'd occasionally spot him, just by chance, sitting on a park bench, staring blankly at nothing. And in those moments, I felt it, the full circle of justice. The man who once towered over me had been reduced to exactly what he tried to make me, invisible. But here's the twist you didn't expect. The last time I saw Richard, it wasn't in a courtroom or on the news or even in prison. It was late one night, walking home after a long day. I turned a corner and there he was, slumped against a wall in the shadows, filthy, unshaven, a bottle clutched in his trembling hand. His eyes met mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "You did this, didn't you?" And I smiled. Just a small, quiet smile. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because he already knew. He broke down right there, sobbing, muttering that he had nothing left, that he was finished. And for the first time, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even satisfied. I was free. His destruction wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. And I had finally taken it. A few weeks later, I read in the paper that Richard had been found dead in a rundown motel. No foul play, just years of stress, alcohol, and despair catching up to him. No one claimed the body. No funeral was held. He simply vanished from the world, unremembered and unloved. And me? I thrived. My career flourished. My life was filled with people who respected me. And I finally had peace. Because in the end, I didn't just win, I erased him. So let me ask you this. Was it justice that Richard's empire, his family, his freedom, and finally his very existence crumbled into dust? Or was it cruelty to push a man until there was absolutely nothing left of him? What do you think? Did he get what he deserved?